The vampire king found 3 children chained in his enemy's basement, all bearing his unmistakable crimson eyes. They reached toward him with trembling hands. What he didn't know was that their mother had hidden them there to protect them from his own court's assassination attempts, and now his presence had just signed their death warrants. The scent hit Kieran Blackthorne like a physical blow as he descended the crumbling stone steps of the Ashford estate, each breath carrying the impossible fragrance of his own bloodline mixed with terror and something else he couldn't identify. The Vampire King had expected to find Lord Varric's latest psychological trap waiting in these ruins, perhaps a collection of drained corpses arranged to mock his failures or a cache of stolen artifacts meant to lure him into an ambush. What he found instead shattered every assumption he'd built about this night's hunt. 3 small forms huddled in the corner of the basement, their wrists raw from iron manacles that had been forged with silver threading, their faces gaunt with hunger but unmistakably bearing the crimson eyes that had marked the Blackthorn line for 1,000 years. The eldest girl, no more than 6 winters old, raised her head first when his boots touched the stone floor, and the word she whispered nearly brought him to his knees. "Daddy." The sound cut through centuries of carefully constructed emotional armor, a single syllable that carried more power than any spell or weapon he'd ever faced. The other 2 children, mirror images of their sister save for the boy's slightly sharper features, echoed the word with voices that trembled between hope and disbelief. Kieran's hands shook as he examined the chains, his supernatural strength making quick work of the silver-laced iron, despite the burning sensation that crawled up his arms with each touch. The metal had been specifically designed to contain supernatural beings, but whoever had forged these shackles had made them just loose enough to avoid permanent damage, as if the children's captor intended them to survive their imprisonment. The smallest girl, her dark hair matted with grime, reached toward him with fingers that bore tiny scars from the silver, and he lifted her with a gentleness that surprised him after centuries of ruling through calculated cruelty. She smelled of his blood, impossible as it was, but underneath that familiar scent lay traces of something else entirely, a magical signature that spoke of human nobility and desperate protection spells woven with a mother's love. The boy, his eyes wide with the intelligence that seemed far too ancient for his years, studied Kieran's face with the intensity of a scholar examining a precious manuscript. "Sarah," he heard the eldest girl whisper to her siblings, though he hadn't heard her speak the name aloud. "Marcus," she added, her voice carrying an odd authority for one so young. "And I'm Lyra." The names felt right somehow, as if he'd always known them, but had forgotten until this moment. As he gathered the 3 children against his chest, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief, shadows shifted in the darkness above their heads, and Kieran's enhanced hearing caught the subtle scrape of boots against stone and the whisper of steel being drawn from sheaths. His court's assassins had followed him, just as he'd suspected they would, their orders likely coming directly from Chancellor Aldrich, or perhaps even from Lady Morgana herself. Finding these children alive violated the most fundamental law of vampire succession, the ancient decree that forbade royal bloodlines from producing heirs outside of sanctioned political marriages, designed to strengthen alliances and maintain the delicate balance of power that kept their realm stable. The punishment for such transgression was death, not just for the unauthorized heirs, but for any who might protect them, and Kieran realized with growing horror that his presence here had transformed what might have been a secret sanctuary into a death trap. The children seemed to sense the approaching danger, their small hands clutching his coat with surprising strength as he carried them toward the basement's single exit, their trust in him absolute despite having just met the father they'd only known through whispered stories. Above them, he could hear at least 4 distinct heartbeats, each one belonging to a court assassin trained specifically to eliminate threats to the established order, their loyalty bought with promises of power and their consciences long since sacrificed to political necessity. Kieran's mind raced through possible escape routes as he climbed the stone steps, the children's weight negligible in his arms, but their presence making him more vulnerable than he'd been in centuries. Every protective instinct he'd thought long dead, roaring to life with an intensity that bordered on madness. The first assassin appeared as they reached the main floor, a figure wrapped in shadow silk that bent light around its edges, the signature garment of the court's most elite killers, and Kieran felt the familiar surge of predatory fury that had made him legendary among his kind. But the rage was different now, tempered by the need to protect rather than simply destroy, and he found himself calculating angles and distances with a precision born of desperation rather than bloodlust. The children pressed closer against him as steel sang through the air, their fear palpable but mixed with something else that took him a moment to identify as determination, as if they'd been preparing for this moment their entire short lives. Marcus whispered something that sounded like shadow words, syllables that carried power despite coming from such a young throat, and the darkness around them seemed to thicken and pulse with unnatural life. Sarah's grip tightened on his collar, and suddenly Kieran could hear the assassin's thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken. Aloud, their tactical communications and attack patterns laid bare by abilities that shouldn't exist in children so young. Lyra's form seemed to flicker and phase, becoming translucent for brief moments before solidifying again, her body instinctively attempting to access powers that defied everything Kieran thought he knew about vampire genetics and human magical potential. The realization struck him like lightning as he dodged the first assassin's blade and prepared for the inevitable battle that would determine whether these impossible children lived to see another dawn. They weren't just his offspring, products of a forbidden union between vampire royalty and human nobility. They were something entirely new, hybrids whose abilities surpassed anything recorded in the ancient texts, their very existence representing either evolution or catastrophe depending on whose perspective shaped the interpretation. Elena Ashford had loved him once, 2 decades past when duty hadn't yet demanded his marriage to Morgana for the sake of political alliance, and apparently she'd carried more than just memories from their brief time together. Through the children's fragmented whispers as he fought his way through the ruins, Kieran began to piece together a story of sacrifice and desperate planning that painted Elena not as a victim, but as a strategic genius who'd understood the court's machinations better than he'd given her credit for. She'd hidden her pregnancy, raised the children in secret with the help of loyal servants and protective spells, keeping them safe until Lord Varrick's discovery had forced her to implement the final phase of a plan she'd hoped never to use. The basement hadn't been Varrick's prison, but Elena's sanctuary, a place warded against supernatural detection and stocked with enough supplies to sustain 3 growing children for months if necessary. The iron chains merely camouflaged to make any casual observer assume the children were captives rather than refugees. Elena had told them stories of their Shadow King father, who would come when the stars aligned, teaching them to recognize his scent and his voice, preparing them for a reunion she'd prayed would never be necessary, but had planned for, with the thoroughness of a general preparing for siege. The children revealed fragments of their mother's lessons as Kieran carried them through the Ashford estate's labyrinthine passages, their trust in him absolute, because Elena had described him perfectly, down to the way his eyes changed color when he was angry and the precise cadence of his voice when he was trying not to show fear. She'd known about the court's assassination protocols, understood that any unauthorized heirs would be eliminated the moment their existence became known, and had spent years researching bloodline magic and protection spells that might give her children a chance at survival in a world that would see them as abominations to be destroyed rather than innocents to be protected. The basement sanctuary had been compromised not by accident, but by betrayal. Varick's discovery of the children, the result of information sold by someone Elena had trusted, someone who'd known about her secret research and had chosen political advancement over the lives of three extraordinary children whose only crime was existing outside the narrow parameters that vampire law allowed for royal succession. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The journey back to Blackthorn Fortress felt like traversing a minefield of political explosions waiting to detonate, each mile bringing Kieran closer to a confrontation that would reshape the vampire court's power structure or destroy everything he'd built over the past millennium. The triplets remained hidden beneath his midnight cloak, their small bodies pressed against his chest as he rode through the pre-dawn darkness, their presence both a comfort and a terror that gnawed at his ancient heart with each thundering hoofbeat of his destrier. By the time the fortress's obsidian spires appeared on the horizon, Kieran could already sense the agitation rippling through the court's supernatural network, whispers and accusations flowing like poison through the telepathic bonds that connected the realm's most powerful vampires. Lady Morgana's spies had moved with their characteristic efficiency, he realized, their reports already reaching every corner of the political web that kept the vampire nobility locked in their eternal dance of alliance and betrayal. The massive gates of Blackthorn Fortress swung open at his approach, operated by guards whose faces revealed nothing but whose nervous energy betrayed their awareness that momentous events were unfolding beyond their comprehension. And Kieran guided his mount through the courtyard with the measured pace of a king who refused to show weakness, even when his entire world balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Thomas appeared at the stable entrance before Kieran had fully dismounted, the elderly servant's weathered features carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with an intelligence that had served the Blackthorn line for nearly 3 centuries. And without words, he helped transfer the children from beneath the cloak to the safety of his capable hands. The triplets looked up at Thomas with the same instinctive trust they'd shown their father, as if something in their genetic memory recognized him as an ally, and Kieran felt a surge of gratitude for the servant whose loyalty had never wavered, despite the dangerous currents of court politics that had claimed lesser men. Chancellor Aldrich waited in the throne room, his pale features carved from marble and malice in equal measure, flanked by the court's most influential members, who had gathered with the predatory eagerness of vultures sensing imminent carrion. Lady Morgana stood at Aldrich's right hand, her beauty as sharp and deadly as the silver blade she wore at her hip, her green eyes blazing with fury that transformed her perfect features into something magnificent and terrible. The Vampire King had expected this confrontation, but seeing his wife's rage given physical form sent ice through his veins as he realized the depth of betrayal she perceived in his actions. Aldrich's voice carried the weight of centuries when he spoke, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum political damage, as he declared the children abominations, whose very existence threatened the careful balance that had kept their realm stable since the founding of the court. The blood purity laws were ancient, he reminded the assembled nobles, established not from prejudice, but from necessity, designed to prevent the emergence of hybrid offspring whose unpredictable abilities might destabilize the supernatural order that protected them all from the chaos of uncontrolled evolution. Morgana's accusations followed like hammer blows, her voice cracking with emotion as she detailed the humiliation of their barren century together. The political promises that had been broken by his secret liaison with a human woman, the mockery that their marriage had become in the eyes of every vampire who had witnessed their public displays of unity, while knowing that no heirs would ever legitimize their bond. She demanded satisfaction under the ancient codes that governed vampire justice, calling for the immediate execution of the bastard children whose existence made a lie of every alliance their marriage had secured and every treaty their union had sealed. Kieran's response shattered the political facade he'd maintained for over 100 years, his admission that their marriage had been nothing more than a strategic necessity, striking the assembled court like a physical blow. He spoke of duty fulfilled without love, of political obligations that had demanded the sacrifice of personal happiness, of the hollow existence he'd endured while playing the role of devoted husband to a woman he respected but could never truly cherish. The children represented more than unauthorized heirs, he declared with a passion that surprised even himself. They were his only chance at genuine legacy, the living proof that he was capable of love beyond the calculating requirements of political advancement. As the court erupted in accusations and counter-accusations, Thomas guided the triplets through the fortress's hidden passages to Kieran's private chambers, where centuries of accumulated treasures and artifacts bore witness to the vampire king's long and often brutal reign. The children explored their temporary sanctuary with the curious intensity of young minds encountering wonders beyond their previous experience, their small hands touching ancient weapons and mystical artifacts, with a reverence that suggested an instinctive understanding of power and its responsibilities. Lyra discovered her ability to phase through solid matter quite by accident, her hand passing through a marble statue as she reached for a crystalline ornament, her startled gasp echoing through the chamber as she stared at her translucent fingers in wonder and terror. Sarah's awakening came more gradually, fragments of thoughts and emotions bleeding into her consciousness as she struggled to understand the flood of mental impressions that suddenly overwhelmed her young mind. Voices from throughout the fortress whispering their secrets and fears directly into her awareness. Marcus found darkness responding to his will like a faithful pet, shadows lengthening and deepening at his unconscious command, reaching toward him with tendrils that seemed almost alive in their eagerness to serve their newfound master. Thomas watched these manifestations with the calm acceptance of one who had expected such developments, his knowledge of Elena's research allowing him to guide the children through their first encounters with abilities that would have terrified most adults. The old servant spoke in soothing tones of their mother's love and sacrifice, weaving stories of Elena's determination to protect them into lessons about controlling powers that could easily destroy everything they touched if left unchecked. Below them, the court's emergency session continued through the night. Voices raised in argument and accusation as factions formed and reformed around the central question of the children's fate. But Thomas kept the triplets distracted with tales of their father's heroic deeds and their mother's brilliant mind until exhaustion finally claimed them in the hours before dawn. Chancellor Aldrich's patience had always been his greatest weapon, and he deployed it with surgical precision as he waited for the perfect moment to act against children he viewed as existential threats to everything the vampire court represented. The assassins he selected for the task were not merely skilled killers, but artists of death who took pride in leaving no evidence of their passage, vampires whose loyalty to the old ways ran deeper than any personal affection they might harbor for their king. They moved through Blackthorn Fortress like whispers of malevolent wind, their passage unmarked by guards who had been subtly influenced to look elsewhere at crucial moments, their approach to Kieran's chambers as inevitable as the sunrise that would soon force them all to seek shelter from the deadly light. The children's terror at being awakened by steel and shadow triggered an explosion of uncontrolled power that nearly reduced the fortress's east wing to rubble, their combined abilities manifesting with the raw force of a natural disaster unleashed in confined space. Lyra's phasing ability went haywire, causing sections of wall and ceiling to become partially incorporeal before snapping, back to solidity with bone-jarring force that cracked stone and shattered ancient glass. Sarah's mental powers lashed out indiscriminately, overwhelming the assassins with psychic feedback that left them writhing in agony as their own memories and fears were turned against them with crushing intensity. Marcus summoned shadows that had weight and substance, darkness that moved with predatory intelligence and struck with the force of physical blows, tendrils of living night that wrapped around the intruders and squeezed until bones snapped and breath ceased forever. Kieran arrived to find carnage beyond anything he'd witnessed in centuries of warfare, Three elite assassins reduced to broken corpses amid the wreckage of what had been his most private sanctuary. His children huddled together in the center of the destruction, with their eyes glowing like stars and power crackling around them in visible waves. The realization struck him with the force of divine revelation as he knelt beside his offspring and saw the raw potential that burned within their hybrid genetics, like barely contained nuclear fire. They weren't simply his children, products of forbidden love between vampire royalty and human nobility. They were evolution itself, the next step in supernatural development, beings whose abilities transcended the limitations that had defined vampire and human potential for millennia. Thomas emerged from the shadows where he'd hidden during the attack, his ancient face grave with knowledge that he'd carried in secret for too many years. Elena's research had been driven by more than maternal love, he revealed as he helped Kieran assess the damage and tend to the traumatized children. She discovered prophecies and bloodline calculations that suggested the emergence of hybrid offspring who would either usher in a new age of supernatural cooperation or destroy the existing order in an apocalypse of uncontrolled power. Her liaison with Kieran hadn't been chance but careful selection, choosing the vampire whose genetic heritage offered the greatest potential for creating children capable of surviving the court's inevitable attempts at elimination. The basement sanctuary had been only the first layer of Elena's protection, designed to keep the children hidden until they were old enough to begin manifesting the abilities that would make them either saviors or destroyers of everything their parents held dear. The failed assassination attempt proved what Elena had feared and planned for, that nowhere in the vampire realm would be safe for children whose very existence challenged every assumption about power and succession that had governed supernatural society since its founding. Thomas spoke of research facilities hidden throughout the human lands, safe houses prepared by Elena's network of loyal supporters, contingency plans that could keep the triplets alive long enough for them to learn control over abilities that could reshape reality itself if properly channeled. As dawn approached and the fortress erupted into chaos as news of the assassination attempt spread through the court's communication networks, Kieran faced the most difficult decision of his long existence, weighing his responsibilities as vampire king against his duties as father to children who represented either the future of their kind or its ultimate destruction. The decision to flee came to Kieran like lightning striking ancient stone, sudden and irreversible, as he stood amid the wreckage of his chambers, watching Thomas tend to three children whose very existence had just proven too dangerous for the political machinations of vampire court life. Blackthorn Fortress had been his seat of power for 8 centuries, its obsidian walls witness to countless victories and the occasional strategic retreat, but never before had he contemplated abandoning everything he'd built for the sake of protecting something infinitely more precious than crowns or territories, or the fear his name inspired in enemies across the supernatural realm. The Crimson Monastery lurked in his memory like a half-forgotten nightmare, that ancient fortress buried deep within the thornwood, where rebel vampires had once sought sanctuary from the very court justice that now threatened his children, its halls empty for over 300 years, since the last of the insurgents had been dragged back to face execution for their defiance of established order. Thomas moved with the efficiency of centuries as he packed essential supplies and artifacts into traveling packs designed for speed rather than comfort, his weathered hands selecting items that would prove crucial for survival in the wilderness, while avoiding anything that might slow their desperate flight through territory that would soon crawl with court assassins and hunting parties dispatched by Chancellor Aldrich's ruthless efficiency. The children watched these preparations with the solemn attention of young minds that had already learned too much about danger and betrayal, their recent manifestation of devastating power having aged them in ways that transcended mere physical development. And Kieran felt his heart break slightly as he recognized the loss of innocence that war always demanded from its youngest victims. They departed through the fortress's ancient escape tunnels as the first pale hints of dawn began threatening the eastern horizon. Passages carved into living rock by paranoid kings who had understood that even the mightiest stronghold could become a prison under the right circumstances. And Kieran carried Marcus on his shoulders, while Lyra and Sarah walked beside him with the determined grace of children who had learned to match adult paces through necessity rather than choice. The journey through the Thornwood tested every survival skill Kieran had accumulated during his millennium of existence, the ancient forest presenting obstacles that ranged from merely inconvenient to potentially lethal for travelers burdened with young companions whose supernatural abilities remained largely uncontrolled and whose endurance had yet to match their incredible potential for destruction. Twisted trees older than vampire civilization formed a canopy so dense that even supernatural vision struggled to penetrate the perpetual twilight beneath their branches, while roots, thick as castle foundations, created a maze of natural barriers that forced constant detours around obstacles that could easily conceal ambush parties, or worse things that had made the deep woods their hunting grounds. During their first rest stop, beside a stream that tasted of minerals and ancient magic, Lyra surprised her father by speaking of memories that belonged to Elena, stories of the Shadow King who would someday emerge from legend to claim his rightful children, tales that had sustained three lonely young hearts through years of hiding and uncertainty, while their mother worked desperately to prepare them for a destiny none of them fully understood. Sarah's empathic abilities, still raw and largely unfiltered, allowed her to sense the complex emotions that warred within Kieran's ancient heart. The guilt that gnawed at him for having abandoned Elena to face motherhood alone, the love that had ignited the moment he'd heard them whisper "Daddy" in that terrible basement, and the crushing weight of responsibility that came with realizing their survival depended entirely on decisions he made in the coming days and weeks. Marcus demonstrated his growing mastery over shadow manipulation by unconsciously directing darkness to shield them from the worst of the wind and rain, tendrils of living night that moved with protective intent around his sisters and father. Though the boy seemed unaware of his actions until Kieran gently pointed out the way, shadows bent to serve his will, like faithful servants responding to an unspoken master. The youngest triplets' abilities proved particularly unsettling when they encountered a pack of feral vampires that had devolved from civilization into something more akin to rabid beasts, creatures that should have attacked without hesitation, but instead found themselves compelled to kneel in submission as Marcus's shadow-touched will overwhelmed their primitive instincts and forced recognition of his authority despite his apparent youth and vulnerability. These lesser vampires, driven from court society by madness or mutation, or simple inability to adapt to the political complexities that governed supernatural civilization, responded to the boy's power with an obedience that bordered on worship, their savage minds recognizing something that transcended normal hierarchies of age and experience and physical strength. Kieran watched this display with mounting concern, understanding that Marcus's ability to command vampire loyalty through supernatural charisma represented a power that could reshape entire kingdoms if properly developed, but also recognizing the dangerous implications of such authority in the hands of a child who had yet to fully grasp concepts of morality and restraint that took centuries to properly internalize. The Crimson Monastery emerged from the forest depths like a fever dream carved from red stone and bitter memories, its towers and walls constructed from a mineral that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the entire structure an ominous presence that made even supernatural senses recoil from prolonged observation. Ancient protective wards still flickered around the perimeter, weakened by centuries of neglect, but potent enough to conceal their presence from casual magical detection. And Kieran felt a familiar chill as he remembered the last time he'd walked these halls as an executioner rather than a refugee seeking sanctuary. The monastery's interior revealed signs of Elena's recent presence. Chambers that had been cleaned and prepared with supplies cached in hidden alcoves, evidence of planning that must have taken years to implement, without attracting unwanted attention from either vampire courts or human authorities who monitored supernatural activity within their territories. Thomas had spoken truly when he'd claimed knowledge of Elena's contingency plans. Kieran realized as they discovered room after room equipped for extended habitation, from workshops stocked with alchemical equipment to libraries containing texts that had supposedly been destroyed during the great purges that followed the vampire wars of the previous millennium. The children explored their temporary refuge with the cautious curiosity of young minds, encountering wonders that spoke to genetic memories they hadn't known they possessed. Their hands trailing across artifacts and inscriptions that seemed to resonate with the hybrid nature that set them apart from both vampire and human bloodlines. In the monastery's deepest chamber, hidden behind wards that would have challenged even master sorcerers to unravel, Elena's true research facility waited like a shrine to desperate maternal love and scientific brilliance pushed beyond conventional boundaries by necessity and prophetic vision. Ancient texts covered every available surface, their pages filled with notes written in Elena's precise handwriting, calculations and theories and desperate speculation about bloodline convergence and the metaphysical implications of vampire-human hybridization that suggested a level of magical understanding that rivaled the greatest scholars in supernatural history. Prophetic passages had been carefully copied and cross-referenced, fragments of ancient wisdom that spoke of three who would bridge darkness and light, children born of forbidden union who would either herald a new age of cooperation between supernatural and mundane worlds or trigger an apocalypse that would consume both realms in chaos and transformation. Maps covered one entire wall, marking locations of power throughout the known world where ley lines converged and ancient rituals had once been performed, sites that Elena believed might prove crucial for properly channeling the children's abilities when they reached full maturity and needed to choose between salvation and destruction. The scope of Elena's preparation awed even Kieran's ancient perspective, her research encompassing not just the immediate problems of keeping three hybrid children alive and hidden, but the long-term implications of their existence for the entire supernatural ecosystem that had evolved over millennia of careful balance between competing forces. Through journals that chronicled years of patient investigation and dangerous experimentation, Kieran began to understand the devastating truth that Elena had discovered about their relationship and the conception of their children. Her initial approach to him had not been the product of spontaneous attraction or even calculated political maneuvering, but rather the result of extensive genealogical research that had identified him as the vampire whose bloodline offered the greatest potential for producing offspring capable of surviving the inevitable assassination attempts that would follow their discovery by court authorities. Elena had known about the protocols that governed elimination of unauthorized heirs, had studied the methods and motivations that drove vampire nobility to murder children whose only crime was existing outside the narrow parameters that political necessity demanded for legitimate succession. She had deliberately sought out the vampire king, cultivating their brief liaison with the specific intention of conceiving children whose hybrid nature would grant them abilities powerful enough to defend against threats that would destroy normal offspring before they could reach maturity. The ancient prophecy that had guided Elena's research spoke of a time when vampire and human bloodlines would converge to produce beings capable of transcending the limitations that had kept supernatural and mundane worlds separate since the dawn of recorded history. Children who would possess the strengths of both heritages while being bound by the weaknesses of neither. These hybrid offspring would face a fundamental choice that would determine the fate of both realms, either using their unprecedented abilities to forge new alliances and usher in an era of cooperation between species that had viewed each other as prey and predator for countless generations, or allowing their power to corrupt them into destroyers who would reduce both worlds to ashes in their quest for dominance over forces they couldn't fully comprehend. Elena's training regimen for the children became clear through detailed notes that chronicled years of careful instruction designed to help them suppress their emerging abilities until they possessed the wisdom and self-control necessary to wield such power responsibly. She had taught them meditation techniques borrowed from ancient vampire disciplines, breathing exercises that could channel supernatural energy into constructive rather than destructive manifestations, and philosophical lessons about the responsibility that accompanied great power and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The revelation that struck Kieran like a physical blow came in Elena's final entries, written in the weeks before her death, with the desperate urgency of a woman who knew her time was running short, and her children's survival depended on completing preparations that had taken years to implement. Her death had not been the random violence of enemies seeking leverage against the vampire king, but rather the calculated murder executed by Lord Varric, working in coordination with a faction within Kieran's own court that viewed the hybrid children as existential threats to the established order they had spent centuries building and maintaining. Elena had discovered evidence of this conspiracy through careful investigation of court communications and financial records, uncovering a network of vampire nobles who believed that hybrid offspring represented evolution that would eventually supplant pure vampire bloodlines and render their entire civilization obsolete. Chancellor Aldrich's name appeared repeatedly in these conspiracy records, along with several other court members whose public loyalty to Kieran masked private allegiances to preservation of vampire racial purity at any cost, even if that cost included murdering innocent children and betraying oaths of fealty that should have bound them to their king's welfare above all other considerations. The children had not been hidden merely to protect them from court justice, Elena's notes revealed, but rather to prepare them for a war that she had seen coming through prophetic visions and careful analysis of political trends that suggested inevitable conflict between those who embraced supernatural evolution and those who would kill to prevent it from occurring. Her research facility contained detailed battle plans and contingency strategies for scenarios ranging from open court rebellion to systematic genocide of hybrid bloodlines, preparations that painted a picture of coming conflict that would make previous vampire wars seem like minor disagreements in comparison to the existential struggle that awaited her children when they finally emerged from hiding to claim their destiny as bridges between worlds or destroyers of everything their parents had fought to protect. The hunting party that assembled in Blackthorn Fortress's main courtyard represented the finest killers that vampire nobility could field. Their ranks filled with enforcers whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of power and whose consciences had been dulled by centuries of following orders without question or moral consideration. Lady Morgana stood at their head like an avenging angel carved from ice and fury, her silver armor reflecting the pre-dawn starlight while her green eyes burned with the cold fire of a woman whose entire world had been shattered by the discovery of 3 children whose existence made mockery of everything she'd sacrificed for political necessity. Chancellor Aldrich moved among the assembled warriors with the predatory grace of a spider inspecting its web, his pale features showing no emotion as he reviewed final preparations for what he privately considered a cleansing operation necessary to preserve the vampire court's fundamental stability. The enforcers themselves were chosen from the ranks of court vampires who had proven their ruthlessness in previous conflicts, each one bound by blood oaths that ensured absolute obedience to their mission, regardless of personal feelings about killing children who had committed no crime beyond existing outside the narrow parameters that vampire law allowed for legitimate succession. Morgana's motivation transcended simple jealousy or wounded pride, though both emotions certainly fueled the rage that had driven her to volunteer for this hunt, despite the obvious dangers of confronting hybrid offspring whose abilities remained largely unknown and unpredictable. Her position as Kieran's consort had been built upon the foundation of their political marriage, a union that brought together two powerful bloodlines in service of maintaining the delicate alliances that kept the vampire realm stable and prosperous. But the existence of three hybrid heirs threatened to render her century of sacrifice meaningless by providing Kieran with legitimate offspring who could claim succession rights that she would never be able to match through political maneuvering alone. The restoration of her status as Kieran's only viable heir required the elimination of these children, not merely their exile or imprisonment, but their complete destruction, and she had convinced herself that this necessity justified any methods required to achieve success in her mission. Aldrich's calculations operated on a broader scale than personal ambition or wounded pride. His concern focused on preventing the emergence of hybrid bloodlines that could fundamentally alter the vampire court's power structure and potentially destabilize centuries of carefully maintained relationships between supernatural factions throughout the known world. The children represented evolution that could render traditional vampire nobility obsolete, their abilities suggesting potential for growth that might eventually surpass even ancient bloodlines whose power had been accumulated over millennia of careful cultivation and strategic intermarriage designed to concentrate supernatural gifts within specific family lineages. The hunting party moved through the thornwood with military precision despite the forest's natural obstacles, their supernatural senses allowing navigation through terrain that would have challenged even experienced human woodsmen, while their enhanced speed and endurance permitted a pace that would bring them to their target well before dawn, weakened their effectiveness, and gave their quarry advantages that daylight hours might provide to beings whose hybrid nature granted resistance to traditional vampire vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, within the Crimson Monastery's protective walls, Kieran struggled to help his children master abilities that seemed to grow stronger and more unpredictable with each passing day, their hybrid genetics expressing powers that defied everything he thought he understood about supernatural development, and the gradual progression of abilities that normally characterized vampire maturation over decades or centuries rather than weeks. Marcus's training session began normally enough, with simple exercises designed to help him consciously direct the shadow manipulation that had previously manifested only during moments of stress or strong emotion. But his concentration wavered at a crucial moment, and the darkness around him tore open like fabric, revealing glimpses of dimensions that existed parallel to their own reality. Through these shadow portals, briefly visible before Marcus's shocked recoil caused them to collapse, Kieran caught terrifying glimpses of worlds where different evolutionary paths had been taken, realms where vampire and human conflicts had escalated to mutual extinction, or where hybrid bloodlines had indeed conquered both parent species and ruled over wasteland empires built from the ashes of civilizations that had rejected cooperation in favor of dominance through superior force. Sarah's empathic development proved equally disturbing, when her ability to read thoughts and emotions expanded without warning to include fragmentary visions of possible futures. Her young mind suddenly flooded with images of battles yet to be fought and choices yet to be made, potential timelines where her family achieved victory or suffered devastating defeat, depending on decisions that had not yet been reached, but whose outcomes she could perceive with crystalline clarity. The girl's terrified sobbing as these visions overwhelmed her consciousness served as stark reminder that abilities powerful enough to reshape reality carried psychological costs that even adult minds would struggle to bear, let alone children whose emotional development remained years behind their supernatural growth. Lyra's discovery of temporal phasing capabilities occurred during what should have been a simple exercise in controlling her matter displacement abilities, but her concentration slipped, and instead of merely stepping through the monastery's stone walls, she found herself stepping through time itself, experiencing brief moments in the building's past where rebel vampires had once planned their doomed revolution against the very court authorities that now hunted her and her siblings. She returned from these temporal excursions with knowledge she shouldn't possess, and memories of events that had occurred centuries before her birth, her young face pale with the understanding that time itself could be manipulated by will and power sufficient to bend the fundamental forces that governed reality. Kieran watched these manifestations with growing horror as he began to comprehend why Chancellor Aldrich and the court traditionalists viewed his children as existential threats rather than merely political inconveniences, their abilities suggesting potential for growth that could indeed render conventional vampire society obsolete if allowed to develop unchecked by moral constraints or practical limitations. The children's power seemed to feed on itself, each successful manipulation of supernatural forces making the next attempt easier and more ambitious, while their hybrid nature protected them from the gradual exhaustion that normally prevented vampire abilities from being overused during periods of intense development. This exponential growth pattern suggested that within years rather than decades, they might possess capabilities that surpassed even legendary vampire lords, whose names had become synonymous with supernatural mastery, accumulated over millennia of careful study and practice. Dawn approached with the inevitability of execution, as Morgana's hunting party completed their encirclement of the Crimson Monastery, their positions chosen to take advantage of the children's expected weakness during daylight hours, when vampire physiology typically demanded rest and recovery from nocturnal activities. The enforcers moved with practiced coordination as they established overlapping fields of fire and prepared containment spells designed to prevent escape through supernatural means. Their equipment including weapons forged specifically to penetrate hybrid defenses and neutralize abilities that conventional arms might prove unable to counter effectively. Morgana herself took position at the monastery's main entrance, her silver blade humming with enchantments that would disrupt magical shields and cause wounds that resisted supernatural healing, while Aldrich coordinated the assault from a vantage point that allowed oversight of the entire operation, while keeping him safely distant from direct combat that might prove more dangerous than anticipated. The attack began with coordinated strikes against the monastery's weakened protective wards, magical barriers that had been maintained by Elena's preparations, but lacked the power source necessary to resist sustained assault by multiple court wizards working in concert to unravel defenses that had protected rebel vampires for centuries. The children's response to this invasion exceeded even Kieran's worst expectations, as their terror and protective instincts triggered manifestations of power that transformed the battlefield into a supernatural war zone where conventional tactics became irrelevant in the face of abilities that rewrote the rules of engagement. Marcus's shadow manipulation exploded outward in response to the threat against his family, darkness taking physical form as an army of semi-corporeal creatures that moved with predatory intelligence and struck with force sufficient to crush bones and rend flesh, their assault overwhelming half the attacking force before the enforcers could adapt their tactics to counter enemies that existed partially outside normal reality. Lyra's temporal phasing allowed her to appear and disappear seemingly at random throughout the battle, her attacks coming from directions that should have been impossible as she stepped through time to strike from past or future positions, her presence creating chaos among enemy ranks that found themselves fighting an opponent who could violate causality itself to gain tactical advantage. Sarah's empathic abilities weaponized the emotions and memories of their attackers, forcing court vampires to experience the pain and terror of every victim they had claimed during centuries of service to authorities who demanded unquestioning obedience. The psychological assault proving more devastating than physical wounds, as hardened killers found themselves crippled by sudden understanding of the suffering they had inflicted in service to political necessity. The combined effect of these abilities created devastation that exceeded anything recorded in vampire military history. The monastery's ancient stones bearing witness to displays of power that suggested the children's potential had barely begun to manifest despite their young age and limited training. Yet victory came at a cost that chilled Kieran's ancient heart as he observed subtle changes in his children's appearances following their exertion, signs of accelerated aging that had appeared virtually overnight, as if their bodies were paying a temporal price for the supernatural energies they had channeled during the battle. Elena's research notes had warned of this phenomenon, the gradual consumption of life force that occurred when hybrid abilities were pushed beyond safe limits, but seeing the actual effect in his children's slightly more mature features, and knowing that each use of their powers brought them closer to an early death, forced Kieran to confront the terrible possibility that protecting them might ultimately prove indistinguishable from watching them burn out their own lives in service to a destiny they had never chosen for themselves. The decision to return to Blackthorn Fortress struck Kieran like divine revelation as he knelt among the smoking ruins of the monastery's east wing, his children huddled against him with their eyes still glowing from the supernatural energies they had unleashed to defend their sanctuary, their faces bearing the subtle but unmistakable signs of accelerated aging that transformed his protective instincts into something approaching desperation. Running had proven futile, he realized with the bitter clarity that came from watching his offspring pay the price for abilities that grew stronger and more dangerous with each manifestation, their hybrid nature making them targets that would never find true safety in exile. No matter how far they traveled, or how cleverly they concealed themselves from the hunting parties that Aldrich would continue to dispatch, until either the children died or the political structure that demanded their deaths was fundamentally altered. The vampire court operated according to ancient laws that had been established during the founding of their civilization, codes of honor and justice that even Chancellor Aldrich could not simply ignore when formally invoked by legitimate claimants to royal authority. And Kieran recognized that these same laws might provide the only path toward securing his children's survival, while simultaneously resolving the succession crisis that their existence had created within the vampire nobility. His announcement that they would return to face trial by combat sent shockwaves through his small family, Thomas dropping the medical supplies he had been using to tend their wounds, while the triplets looked up at their father with expressions that mixed terror and determination in equal measure. Their recently awakened political awareness making them understand that this decision would likely determine not just their fate, but the future direction of vampire society itself. Lyra, her features now showing signs of approaching adolescence despite her chronological age of barely 6 years, spoke with authority that seemed far too mature for her young voice as she insisted that she and her siblings would stand beside their father in whatever trial awaited them. Her temporal phasing abilities having granted her glimpses of possible futures that made her understand the futility of hiding while others fought for their right to exist. Sarah's precognitive visions had grown stronger since the battle, her mind now capable of perceiving probability threads that stretched weeks and months into potential futures, and her quiet announcement that Elena's research had predicted this exact scenario sent chills through everyone present as they realized that even their mother's death had been part of a larger pattern that was only now beginning to reveal its true scope. Marcus demonstrated the disturbing extent of his developing powers by unconsciously summoning shadows that formed a protective barrier around his family as they prepared for the journey back to court. Darkness that moved with intelligence and seemed to anticipate threats before they could fully materialize. His abilities now sufficient to command lesser vampires through sheer force of supernatural charisma that transcended normal hierarchies of age and experience. The return journey to Blackthorn Fortress took place in broad daylight, a deliberate choice that demonstrated both Kieran's confidence in his children's hybrid resistance to traditional vampire vulnerabilities and his determination to approach the court from a position of strength rather than skulking through darkness like criminals fleeing justice. The children rode their own mounts with surprising grace for beings who had spent most of their lives in hiding, their supernatural heritage granting them instinctive mastery over animals that would normally shy away from vampire presence, while their accelerated development allowed them to match adult paces without the fatigue that should have affected such young travelers. Word of their approach preceded them through the supernatural communication networks that connected the vampire realm, servants and scouts carrying news of the king's return, along with descriptions of his hybrid offspring that transformed rumor into legend with each retelling. Stories of children who commanded shadows and phased through reality itself, spreading through the court like wildfire, and creating factions of opinion that ranged from terrified opposition to curious fascination. Chancellor Aldrich received reports of their imminent arrival with the cold satisfaction of a strategist whose carefully laid plans were finally approaching their culmination. His agents having prepared the Great Hall for a trial by combat that would settle questions of succession and hybrid legitimacy, once and for all, according to laws that even his enemies could not dispute or circumvent. The formal challenge was issued the moment Kieran crossed the fortress threshold, his voice carrying the authority of centuries as he demanded justice for his children under the ancient codes that governed vampire society, invoking rights that had not been exercised in over 400 years but remained legally binding upon any court that claimed legitimacy through traditional structures. Aldrich's response came with the precision of a blade thrust, accepting the challenge while setting terms that revealed the depth of his preparation and the extent of his confidence in achieving final victory over threats to the established order that he had spent decades carefully maintaining. The trial would pit Kieran against 3 champions simultaneously, each one selected for specific capabilities that would test different aspects of his legendary combat abilities, while failure would result in immediate execution for both father and children, according to protocols that left no room for appeals or alternative outcomes. Lady Morgana volunteered as the first champion with the fury of a woman whose entire identity had been shattered by revelations of her husband's true feelings and the existence of children who represented everything she had been denied through a century of barren marriage. Her silver blade singing with enchantments designed specifically to counter vampire regeneration and supernatural defenses. The second champion emerged from the ranks of court enforcers in the form of Cassius Thornfield, a vampire warrior whose reputation for brutality had been earned through centuries of crushing rebellions and eliminating threats to court stability. His massive form armored in plates forged from meteoric iron that would resist even supernatural attacks, while his weapon carried blessings from ancient powers that predated vampire civilization itself. Aldrich himself claimed the position of third champion, his pale features showing no emotion as he announced his intention to personally ensure that this threat to vampire purity would be eliminated regardless of the cost in blood or political upheaval, his own abilities honed through millennia of political combat that had taught him to view violence as merely another tool for achieving necessary objectives. The children's insistence on participating in the trial, despite Kieran's desperate protests, revealed the extent to which their accelerated development had granted them understanding of adult concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice that should have remained beyond their comprehension for years to come. Sarah's precognitive abilities allowed her to perceive the futility of attempting to survive as refugees while their father faced overwhelming odds alone, her visions showing timeline after timeline where separation led to the destruction of their entire family through systematic hunting that would eventually track them down, regardless of how well they hid or how far they ran. Marcus's shadow manipulation had evolved to include the ability to perceive emotional resonances within darkness itself, allowing him to sense the fear and uncertainty that even court loyalists felt when contemplating the implications of executing children whose only crime was existing outside political boundaries that many privately questioned, but few dared to challenge openly. Lyra's temporal phasing granted her access to memories embedded within the fortress itself, centuries of accumulated experiences that included previous trials by combat and their outcomes, knowledge that revealed patterns and possibilities that could be exploited by those clever enough to perceive them and bold enough to act upon insights that transcended normal strategic thinking. Elena's research had indeed predicted this confrontation with uncanny accuracy, Her journals containing detailed analysis of court psychology and political dynamics that had allowed her to prepare contingency plans for scenarios that seemed impossible until they began unfolding exactly as she had foreseen through combinations of supernatural insight and brilliant deductive reasoning. Hidden throughout the fortress were caches of supplies and information that Elena had positioned during her secret visits. Resources that included weapons designed specifically to enhance hybrid abilities and protective talismans that would provide crucial advantages during combat that would determine whether vampire society evolved or remained locked in traditions that increasingly seemed inadequate for addressing challenges that the future would inevitably bring. As news of the impending trial spread throughout the vampire realm, unexpected, support began emerging from sources that surprised even Kieran's ancient political instincts. Court members who had remained silent during previous controversies now stepping forward to voice opinions that revealed decades of hidden dissatisfaction with leadership that prioritized maintaining power over addressing genuine needs of their civilization. Thomas revealed himself as more than merely a loyal servant, his centuries of apparent subservience having concealed a network of contacts throughout vampire society who had grown tired of Aldrich's oppressive policies and Morgana's petty tyrannies. Reformers who saw the hybrid children as symbols of possibility, rather than threats to stability that needed elimination, regardless of moral cost. Several younger court members began questioning whether traditions that demanded the murder of innocent children truly served their people's best interests. Their public statements creating fractures in previously solid political alliances, while inspiring others to examine their own beliefs about vampire superiority and the wisdom of maintaining absolute separation from human society that had produced such remarkable hybrid offspring. Lady Isabel's confession sent shockwaves through the court's social structure when she revealed that she had been secretly funding research into hybrid genetics for decades, her scientific curiosity and progressive political views having convinced her that vampire human children represented evolutionary advancement rather than corruption that needed cleansing through violence. Morgana's own sister stepping forward as an advocate for the children created a scandal that transcended mere political disagreement and entered the realm of family betrayal, her support for hybrid legitimacy undermining one of the trial's key justifications while demonstrating that even blood relationships could not overcome ideological differences about the future direction of vampire civilization. The court began fracturing along lines that had been invisible until this crisis forced previously hidden opinions into open confrontation. Traditionalists, rallying around Aldrich's vision of maintaining vampire purity through whatever means proved necessary, while reformers gathered support for changes that would allow their society to evolve beyond restrictions that no longer served practical purposes in a world where supernatural and human populations increasingly influenced each other through contact that could not be prevented through isolation alone. These emerging factions transformed what should have been a simple trial by combat into something approaching civil war, with the outcome determining not just the fate of 3 hybrid children, but the fundamental character of vampire society for generations to come. The ancient Crimson Arena had not witnessed formal combat for over 3 centuries, its blood-soaked stones bearing witness to conflicts that had shaped vampire civilization through displays of supernatural prowess that transcended mere political disagreement and entered the realm of evolutionary struggle between competing visions of their species' destiny. Representatives from every major vampire house filled the tiered seating that surrounded the circular fighting ground, their presence transforming what should have been a simple succession dispute into a spectacle that would be remembered and analyzed for generations regardless of its outcome, while scrying crystals positioned throughout the arena broadcast images of the proceedings to supernatural communities across the known world. Chancellor Aldrich entered the arena with the measured pace of a man who had orchestrated countless executions and viewed this trial as merely another administrative necessity, his pale features showing no emotion as he drew the ancient blade that had served him through millennia of political violence, its edge humming with enchantments designed to disrupt supernatural healing and leave wounds that would resist even vampire regeneration. Cassius Thornfield followed with the predatory grace of a born killer, his massive frame encased in armor forged from meteoric iron that gleamed with protective wards, while his weapon carried blessings from powers that predated vampire civilization, his reputation for brutality having been earned through centuries of crushing rebellions and eliminating threats to court stability with methodical efficiency that left no room for mercy or hesitation. Lady Morgana completed the Trinity of Champions with steps that carried the fury of a woman whose entire existence had been revealed as elaborate political theater, her silver blade singing with harmonics that spoke of preparation and determination to settle marital disputes through blood rather than endure another moment of the hollow pretense that had defined their century together as partners in a union built on necessity rather than affection or genuine respect. Kieran faced his opponents with the calm acceptance of inevitability that came from understanding that this confrontation had been building since the moment he first discovered three children chained in a basement, their existence representing challenges to established order that could only be resolved through trial by combat according to laws older than any living vampire's memory. The opening exchanges revealed the extent of preparation that each champion had undertaken. Their coordinated attacks designed to exploit different aspects of Kieran's legendary abilities while preventing him from utilizing the tactical advantages that had made him feared throughout the supernatural world for over a millennium. Aldrich's approach emphasized precision and patience, his blade work calculated to inflict cumulative damage while avoiding the devastating counterattacks that had ended so many of Kieran's previous opponents, each strike planned to weaken defenses gradually rather than seeking immediate decisive victory that might expose vulnerabilities to exploitation. Cassius relied on overwhelming force and supernatural resilience, his massive strength allowing him to shrug off injuries that would cripple lesser warriors, while his armor provided protection sufficient to absorb punishment that would destroy conventional defenses. His strategy focused on wearing down Kieran's stamina through sustained assault that would eventually create openings for finishing blows. Morgana fought with the desperate fury of personal betrayal, transformed into weapon, her attacks carrying emotional intensity that transcended mere physical violence and entered psychological warfare, designed to exploit guilt and regret that she believed would compromise her husband's focus at crucial moments during combat that would determine whether their marriage ended in divorce or death. The battle's momentum shifted repeatedly as supernatural abilities clashed in displays of power that sent shockwaves through the arena's protective barriers, ancient stones cracking under the pressure of energies that had not been unleashed in confined space for centuries, while spectators pressed against restraining fields that struggled to contain forces that threatened to spill beyond the designated combat zone. Kieran's centuries of experience began telling as he adapted to his opponent's strategies, his legendary tactical intelligence allowing him to identify patterns and exploit weaknesses that became apparent only after extended observation of their coordinated assault techniques. But the sustained effort of fighting three champions simultaneously was taking its toll on even his supernatural endurance. The turning point came when Sarah's precognitive abilities detected the approaching climax moments before it manifested in reality, her mental warning allowing Marcus to begin summoning shadows, while Lyra prepared for temporal displacement despite their father's explicit orders to remain hidden until the trial's conclusion, regardless of its outcome. The children's arrival at the arena's climax transformed the nature of the combat from formal duel into something approaching supernatural warfare, their coordinated assault utilizing abilities that none of the champions had prepared for because hybrid powers remained largely theoretical concepts rather than practical combat considerations that required specific countermeasures. Marcus's shadow manipulation exploded across the arena floor, like living darkness given malevolent intelligence, tendrils of corporeal night that struck with physical force while simultaneously existing partially outside normal reality, making them nearly impossible to block or counter through conventional defensive techniques that relied on intercepting attacks that followed predictable physical laws. The shadows moved with tactical coordination that suggested battlefield intelligence far beyond what should have been possible from a 6-year-old child. Their assault patterns designed to separate the champions and prevent them from maintaining the coordinated advantage that had been wearing down Kieran's defenses through sustained pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah's mental disruption proved even more devastating than her brother's shadow assault. Her empathic abilities weaponizing the emotions and memories of opponents whose psychological defenses had been constructed to resist conventional mental intrusion, rather than the hybrid techniques that allowed her to bypass traditional barriers through methods that pure vampire telepathy could never achieve. Aldrich found himself paralyzed by sudden understanding of every life he had taken in service to political necessity. Centuries of accumulated guilt, crashing into his consciousness with force sufficient to shatter concentration that had been maintained through millennia of careful emotional control and strategic detachment from the human cost of his administrative decisions. Cassius experienced the pain and terror of every victim his brutality had claimed, his legendary physical resilience proving useless against psychological assault that turned his own memories into weapons that struck at vulnerabilities he had never recognized or prepared to defend against through armor or supernatural resistance that protected only against external threats. Morgana's mental defenses crumbled under empathic pressure that forced her to confront the hollowness of her century-long marriage. The bitter recognition that her husband's respect had never transformed into genuine affection, despite decades of hoping that political necessity might eventually bloom into something resembling love, or at least comfortable companionship between partners who shared common goals. Lyra's temporal phasing created chaos throughout the arena as she appeared and disappeared seemingly at random, her attacks coming from past and future positions that violated causality in ways that made conventional defensive strategies impossible to maintain. Her ability to step outside linear time, granting tactical advantages that transformed the nature of combat itself into something beyond normal strategic comprehension. The combined effect of three hybrid abilities operating in perfect coordination overwhelmed champions whose preparation had focused on defeating a single opponent, rather than facing evolutionary warfare that utilized techniques beyond anything recorded in vampire military history or theoretical combat analysis. Victory came at a cost that transformed triumph into tragedy, as Morgana, mortally wounded by Lyra's temporal blade, that had struck from a future position while existing simultaneously in present reality, used her dying breath to speak words that released Kieran from political bonds that had defined their relationship for over a century. Her acknowledgement that he had never truly loved her, despite decades of hoping otherwise, carried the weight of absolute honesty that death often brings to those whose lives have been built upon necessary deceptions. Her final gift being freedom from obligations that had prevented him from pursuing genuine happiness with the woman whose memory now lived on through 3 extraordinary children. The arena fell silent as Chancellor Aldrich and Cassius Thornfield lay defeated, their bodies bearing wounds that would heal given sufficient time, but their political authority permanently broken by defeat that demonstrated the futility of opposing evolution itself when it manifested through beings whose abilities transcended traditional limitations that had governed vampire society since its founding. The cost of victory became apparent as Kieran gathered his children close and observed changes that chilled him more than any physical wound could have achieved, their faces now showing clear signs of adolescence despite chronological ages that should have kept them children for years to come, their accelerated development having consumed life force at rates that made their survival pyrrhic at best if current trends continued unchecked. Sarah's precognitive abilities revealed the devastating truth about their remaining lifespan, her visions showing probability threads that gave them perhaps a decade before their hybrid nature burned through their biological reserves completely, their extraordinary powers consuming the very life they were meant to protect, in a cruel irony that made their political victory feel more like delayed execution than genuine salvation. The vampire court, subdued by witnessing displays of power that redefined their understanding of what supernatural beings could achieve when evolutionary pressure produced abilities beyond traditional parameters, reluctantly acknowledged the triplets as legitimate heirs whose rights could no longer be disputed through legal or political maneuvering. Yet Kieran found himself facing the heartbreaking realization that ruling meant nothing if he lost his children to gifts that would kill them through overuse, their hybrid nature granting them abilities powerful enough to reshape civilization, while simultaneously condemning them to lifespans that measured in years rather than the centuries that vampire genetics normally provided. The assembled nobles began filing out of the arena with expressions that mixed awe and terror in equal measure, their understanding of vampire society's future having been fundamentally altered by witnessing combat that demonstrated the emergence of evolutionary successors whose very existence challenged assumptions about supernatural hierarchy that had remained unchallenged for millennia. Thomas approached with medical supplies and concerned expressions that revealed his understanding of the biological price the children had paid for their supernatural exertion. His centuries of service to the Blackthorn line, having prepared him for many eventualities, but not for watching children age years in moments while defending their right to exist against those who would murder them for political convenience. Lady Isabel emerged from the crowd of departing nobles with tears in her eyes and determination in her voice as she offered the resources of her secret research network to finding solutions for hybrid aging that Elena's notes had identified as potential problems, but had not provided complete answers for addressing through conventional magical or medical intervention. The arena's blood-soaked stones bore witness to transformation that transcended mere political change and entered the realm of evolutionary shift, vampire civilization having crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, regardless of whether the hybrid children survived long enough to fully inherit the legacy their parents had died to secure for them. The weeks following their victory in the Crimson Arena passed in a blur of desperate research as Kieran threw every resource of the reformed vampire court into finding a solution for the accelerated aging that threatened to consume his children's lives within a decade. Their hybrid nature having granted them extraordinary powers at the cost of biological stability that normal vampire genetics would have provided through millennia of evolutionary refinement. Elena's hidden research chambers yielded fragments of theoretical solutions, ancient texts that spoke of life force transference and longevity redistribution through rituals that had been attempted only rarely throughout vampire history, due to the enormous personal costs they demanded from participants who understood that extending one life often required shortening others in carefully calculated exchanges. Lady Isabel's secret network provided additional resources as vampire scholars who had spent centuries studying bloodline magic emerged from hiding to offer expertise that had been suppressed by previous regimes, more interested in maintaining power than advancing understanding of supernatural genetics and the possibilities they might offer for addressing problems that traditional approaches could never solve. Thomas coordinated these efforts with the efficiency of centuries spent managing complex logistics, his servant's perspective having granted him insights into court operations that proved invaluable when organizing research projects that required cooperation between vampire houses whose members had been taught to view each other as competitors rather than potential collaborators in endeavors that transcended individual ambition. The children themselves participated in this research with the mature understanding that their accelerated development had granted them, their faces now bearing the features of young adults despite their chronological ages remaining frozen at 6 years, their expressions carrying wisdom and determination that should have taken decades to acquire through experience, rather than supernatural evolution, compressed into months of crisis and revelation. Marcus's shadow. Manipulation had evolved to include perception of temporal flows that existed parallel to normal reality, his abilities revealing patterns in the aging process that suggested their hybrid nature was attempting to compress entire lifespans into abbreviated periods rather than extending existence through the gradual development that characterized normal vampire maturation over centuries of careful growth and accumulated power. Sarah's precognitive visions provided crucial insights into potential solutions, her mind now capable of perceiving probability threads that extended far enough into possible futures to evaluate the long-term consequences of various ritual approaches. Her warnings about catastrophic failures, preventing several attempts that might have killed them all while providing hope that successful solutions remained achievable through proper preparation and understanding. Lyra's temporal phasing allowed direct examination of their aging process from perspectives that existed outside linear time, her ability to step into past and future versions of herself, revealing the specific mechanisms through which their hybrid genetics consumed life force to fuel abilities that operated beyond normal supernatural parameters. Knowledge that proved essential for developing countermeasures that could address root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. The solution emerged through synthesis of Elena's theoretical frameworks, with practical insights gained from months of careful observation and experimentation, ancient texts revealing that life force could indeed be redistributed through voluntary sacrifice. But the traditional approaches had always assumed single donors providing complete solutions, rather than cooperative efforts that might distribute costs among multiple participants, willing to contribute portions of their longevity for collective benefit. Kieran's initial response was immediate and absolute as he prepared to sacrifice his own immortality to save his children. Centuries of accumulated life force, representing more than sufficient resources to stabilize their aging indefinitely, while allowing them to develop their abilities at sustainable rates that would not consume their biological reserves faster than hybrid genetics could replenish them. The Vampire King's willingness to die for his offspring surprised no one who had witnessed his transformation from distant ruler to devoted father, but his children's unanimous rejection of this solution demonstrated their own evolution beyond the selfish individualism that had characterized vampire society since its founding, their hybrid nature having granted them perspectives that transcended traditional assumptions about power and sacrifice and the relationships between personal survival and collective welfare. Marcus spoke with authority that seemed impossible from someone whose chronological age remained measured in years rather than decades. His proposal for distributing the ritual's costs among all willing court members, representing revolutionary thinking that challenged fundamental assumptions about vampire society and the competitive hierarchies that had governed their civilization for millennia. The concept of voluntary cooperation for mutual benefit struck most court members as either impossible idealism or dangerous precedent that could undermine the carefully maintained power structures that had kept their realm stable through centuries of political maneuvering and strategic alliance building designed to prevent any single faction from achieving dominance over their collective destiny. Yet the children's demonstration of hybrid abilities had proven that evolution was occurring regardless of political preferences, their very existence representing change that could not be prevented through traditional methods of control and suppression that had historically maintained order through fear and calculated violence, rather than genuine cooperation between supernatural beings who shared common interests, despite their competitive instincts. Lady Isabel became the first volunteer for the collective ritual, her decision to contribute decades of her own longevity, inspiring other progressive court members to follow her example in supporting solutions that represented fundamental departures from individualistic approaches that had defined vampire culture since its earliest recorded history. Thomas surprised everyone by revealing that his apparent humanity had been carefully maintained disguise, his true nature as ancient vampire, whose loyalty to the Blackthorn line extended back to the dynasty's founding, allowing him to contribute centuries of accumulated life force while maintaining sufficient reserves to continue serving the family that had earned his devotion through generations of honorable leadership and personal sacrifice. Even former enemies stepped forward to participate in the ritual as understanding spread that hybrid evolution represented inevitable change that could either be embraced through cooperation or resisted through conflict that would ultimately prove futile, given the children's demonstrated abilities to defend themselves against any force that vampire society could deploy against them. The preparation for the life-sharing ritual required weeks of careful coordination, as volunteer participants underwent purification processes designed to ensure their life force could be safely transferred without carrying psychological or spiritual contamination that might destabilize the recipients who needed healing, rather than additional trauma from donors whose own experiences included centuries of accumulated guilt and regret. Ancient circles were carved into the arena floor, where political victory had been achieved through violence. Their geometric patterns designed to channel supernatural energies in precise configurations that would allow controlled distribution of longevity among multiple participants without the catastrophic failures that had marked previous attempts at life force manipulation throughout vampire history. The ritual itself began at midnight on the winter solstice, when supernatural energies reached their peak concentration and the barriers between different planes of existence became sufficiently permeable to allow transfers that would normally be impossible through conventional magical techniques. Dozens of volunteers joining hands around the central pattern where Kieran knelt with his children as streams of golden light began flowing between participants in patterns that defied normal understanding of how life force could be manipulated or redistributed. The children's aging process stabilized gradually as centuries of donated longevity flowed into their hybrid systems, their features returning to chronologically appropriate appearances while retaining the wisdom and maturity that accelerated development had granted them. Their abilities remaining intact, but now operating at sustainable levels that would allow normal growth and development without the biological costs that had threatened to kill them within years. Kieran felt portions of his own immortality flowing away as the ritual progressed, centuries of accumulated life force joining the collective pool that sustained his children's stabilization. But the loss felt like liberation rather than sacrifice, as he watched his offspring return to childhood, while retaining the extraordinary gifts that made them bridges between vampire and human worlds. The successful completion of the ritual marked more than just medical victory over hybrid aging problems, its cooperative nature having demonstrated possibilities for vampire society that transcended traditional hierarchies and competitive structures that had governed their civilization for millennia, proving that collective action could achieve results that individual effort could never accomplish, regardless of how powerful or determined single participants might be. Kieran's subsequent abdication of absolute authority surprised the court less than his replacement of monarchical rule with council system designed to prevent any single vampire from wielding the kind of unchecked power that had nearly resulted in his children's execution for political convenience rather than genuine justice based on moral principles that transcended narrow self-interest and factional loyalty. The triplets took their places as equal members of this new governing structure, despite their youth, their hybrid perspectives, and extraordinary abilities, making them valuable contributors to decision-making processes that would shape vampire society's future evolution toward cooperation with human civilization, rather than continued isolation and superiority that had become increasingly untenable as both species developed technologies and abilities that made peaceful coexistence more beneficial than perpetual conflict. Years passed as the reformed vampire court adapted to collaborative governance that emphasized collective welfare over individual advancement, the children growing at normal rates while developing their abilities under careful guidance that prevented the dangerous power surges that had nearly killed them during their early manifestations of hybrid potential that exceeded anything recorded in supernatural history. The final scene found the family in gardens that bloomed under natural sunlight, their hybrid resistance to traditional vampire vulnerabilities, having allowed them to create spaces where both supernatural and natural elements could coexist in harmony, that symbolized the broader changes their existence had brought to a civilization previously defined by darkness and separation from the world beyond their carefully guarded borders. Kieran watched his children play with the bittersweet satisfaction of a father whose sacrifices had achieved more than personal happiness, their laughter echoing through grounds that had once known only political maneuvering and calculated violence, but now served as testament to possibilities for transformation that love and determination could accomplish even when facing seemingly impossible obstacles. Sarah's quiet observation that Elena's spirit had found peace carried the weight of precognitive certainty as she sensed her mother's consciousness finally releasing the protective vigilance that had sustained it beyond death. Elena's sacrifice having achieved its ultimate purpose through ensuring her children's survival, while transforming the world they would inherit into something worthy of the extraordinary gifts their hybrid nature had granted them for purposes that extended far beyond personal survival to encompass the evolution of supernatural civilization itself toward futures that honored both their vampire heritage and human potential for growth and change and cooperation in service of ideals that transcended species boundaries and the ancient prejudices that had kept both worlds smaller and less magnificent than they could become through unity rather than division.